Here we are for section 6, which we will note in our title. Now we're going to talk about all cargo aircraft, these big beasts that are dedicated exclusively to the movement of cargo. The first we're going to look at is the Boeing 747-8F, which is a real workhorse in the air cargo business. We will try to make better use of our images in these slides as well, starting off with some commentary on the right-hand side. The obvious thing to point out that the 747-8F is nose loaded. Pallets are loaded from the front of the aircraft. We can also see a cargo door for the lower deck, as it's called. That nose loader in the front, that's the main deck. We see an image of a helicopter on the main deck inside the aircraft to give one an idea of just how big these aircraft really are. A couple of things to point out in terms of capacity. On the left-hand side, and it's provided in both pounds and kilos, the maximum takeoff weight, that's cargo and the aircraft itself. Call it 450,000 kilos, almost 1 million pounds. But the maximum revenue payload, this is cargo itself, 134,000 kilos, or 134 tons. We're going to see a slide in a minute that expresses cargo capacity for different Boeing aircraft expressed in metric tons. 1 metric ton equals 1,000 kilos. Let's be clear on that. Our aircraft here, as we said, 134 tons, upwards of 300,000 pounds, 295,000 pounds of cargo. That's a lot of freight. In terms of volume capacity, the main deck, as we said, that nose loading main deck, we will note again the use of cubic meters. We saw that in ocean freight, about 693 cubic meters, 24,462 cubic feet. The lower compartments, that door we see on the lower left-hand side of the aircraft, call it 151 cubic meters, 5,330 cubic feet. This aircraft has a big weight capacity and a big space capacity. The whole story about weight versus volume, just like we saw in ocean freight for LCL, is going to come up again in air freight. This is the slide that we alluded to just a moment ago. Different cargo capacity, but for Boeing freighter aircraft. Boeing being a U.S. company headquartered up in Seattle. We just looked at the 747-8F. We said it could carry 134 metric tons. That's why it's right below, as we see on the upper right-hand corner, the 140 metric ton level. We looked at a 777 earlier, but that was a 777 passenger aircraft. Now we're looking at a 777F, a freighter, at about 100 metric tons. To the left of that, we see a 747-400 BCF, a little over 100 tons. And then as the aircraft gets smaller, needless to say, the cargo capacity gets smaller. 767s at about, call it 50 tons. The 737, little below 20. And then finally to the lower left-hand side, different configurations of a 757, a 200 SF, a 400 SF, a 300 SF, at varying capacities up to around 40 metric tons. Remember, a metric ton equals 1,000 kilos. Let's look at another all-cargo aircraft, which is the Airbus A330. We had looked at as a passenger aircraft. It can be configured as a freighter too. Here, the A330-200F. We can see its specifications right in the middle of the slide. About 467 cubic meters, a maximum range, almost 4,600 miles, 4,598, and a payload of 65,000 kilos, 65 metric tons. Not a really big aircraft. And the range at 5,000 miles is okay, but somewhat limited in range as well. These are the type of aircraft that freight forwarders contract with various airlines to move cargo on. As U.S. importers, we want to be dealing with forwarders that have relationships with both all cargo airlines as well as passenger airlines. It just provides us, as the importer, with a wider variety and frequency of aircraft to choose from. This is an interesting slide for a couple of reasons. We're still looking at the Airbus A330-200 freighter. We see on the lower right-hand side, that's the inside of the aircraft. We'll note on the floor that pallets and other unit loading devices can be easily moved about, But of equal interest on the left-hand side is a rendering of how cargo is loaded on the aircraft, on pallets, on unit loading devices, which we'll talk a lot about in just a little bit, but just providing a visual of how these aircraft are loaded. One of the bigger points being, do freight forwarders tender cargo to the airlines as loose cargo, and then the airlines build up the pallets? Or do the forwarders tender goods already palletized, already unitized? These are important questions that freight forwarders need answers to as they plan their air import strategy. This slide provides some good visuals as to how these aircraft look both before and after they're loaded. We talked a little bit about main deck and lower deck, or belly freight as it's sometimes called. Let's take another look at the A330, its main deck capacity, as we see on the upper left, cargo configuration and volumes. This is where we start to talk in a little bit more detail about how palletized or unitized cargo looks, along with a reiteration about height, length, and width restrictions. Let's bear in mind, let's say again, that either the airlines are going to build up these pallets or unit loading devices, or the forwarders are going to do that before delivering to the airlines. Either way, somebody is going to build up these pallets, as it's called. We can start to see, especially in the upper left-hand side, where pallets are oftentimes built to the contours of the aircraft, with a height restriction of 96 inches, with a length restriction of 125, and a width of 96. This is contoured freight. It's built to accommodate the rounded contours of the fuselage of the aircraft, and then they're placed side by side, butted together, to make it look like one unit, but it's actually two. That's why the first two that we're looking at, upper left and to the immediate right of that, side by side, 96 inches high. AMA containers, we'll talk about that in just a bit. Single row pallets as well. And then, depending on how pallets are built up, this is in the second row we're looking at now, how many types of positions, a pallet position, as it's called, when configured in these ways, can the A330 accommodate? First, on the lower left, at 22 positions to 23, AMA containers up to 9, single row pallets up to 16. All of this matters to the airline and the freight forwarders because they want to maximize their payload, their yield, their profitability on each flight. It should be clear now that whether we're an airline, a forwarder, or an importer, we need to understand how these aircraft work and what their capacities are. Last in this section is the lower deck capacity of that same Airbus A330-200F, asking ourselves once again, what is the magic number for lower deck freight, belly freight? 64 inches. We can see it on our first pallet on the left. We can still have pretty much the same length and width at 125 and 96 inches, but the height can't be higher than 64. Same goes for the middle configuration, the lower deck winged pallet, as well as a ULD, a unit loading device, that we haven't talked about at all, but that we're going to talk in considerable detail, is an LD3 container, a self-contained unit loading device with that same height restriction of 64 inches. Clearly, this has not been a comprehensive or exhaustive portrayal of passenger and cargo aircraft, but hopefully it brings to the forefront of people's thinking that aircraft have range restrictions, cubic foot or cubic meter restrictions, certainly weight constrictions, and they're configured in such a way using pallets and other unit loading devices to maximize the payload. The final message being that the carrier, the freight forwarder, and the importer have to work together to make air freight work properly. That will wrap up this section. When we come back, we'll be talking about the pros and cons of passenger versus all-cargo aircraft. Some pretty good comparisons there. We hope you come back soon.